the place of rebellion, not of obedience. There was no Torah scroll floating in that current, no priest counting tithes on the shore. There was only a man named John, or in older tongue Johanna, calling people to plunge beneath living water to meet the great life that existed before any god of law or stone. That current is older than every text that ever tried to own it. Even Genesis admits it. The waters were already there before any creator spoke. The Spirit moved over them because the water was the source itself. John remembered what the temple forgot. John was no Jew. The label was attached centuries later by editors who needed to graft his movement into the script of a nation that did not claim him. His practice came from the East, from the Mandean or Nasorean stream, where purification meant rebirth, not ritual compliance. He lived outside the city because the city was corruption itself. He mocked the priests, he refused circumcision, and he ate whatever the land gave him. He called the temple a den of thieves long before Jesus repeated the line. The entire Torah world of sacrifice, priesthood, and Sabbath meant nothing to him. His baptism was an act of defiance. It was the water saying no to the knife, no to the blood, no to the market of salvation. When Jesus came to him, the record says John recognized him, but the record we have is not the one John or his followers wrote. The earliest gospel, the one attributed to Mark, contains no claim that Jesus was a Messiah, no virgin birth, no resurrection narrative beyond the women fleeing in fear. That ending is abrupt because the editors who followed could not stand silence. They added their own endings to make the story safe, to make it Jewish, to give it a Torah stamp. But in the earliest form, Jesus is simply another baptizer who inherits John's path. The water is the message. The river is the teacher. No temple is needed. The text itself betrays its own redactions. Every passage where Jesus quotes the law as divine authority smells of later ink. The rhythm of those sayings differs from the older style. They were inserted by writers who could not allow a teacher outside their framework. They turned him from a Nasorean rebel into a Torah preacher. The disguise is transparent if one reads without fear. The man who dined with sinners, touched the unclean, and broke Sabbath law on purpose cannot be the champion of the very code he defied. His parables ridicule the priests. His anger burns against the sellers of holiness. He curses the fig tree of the temple because it no longer bears fruit. These are the words of a man who saw through the machine built by the Seleucid and Hasmonean rulers and their successors. The disciples that the redactors name were not founders of churches. They were followers of the water path, initiates of the current that flowed before the temple cult was born. When later writers Judaized them, they became props for legitimacy. Names were multiplied, genders changed, titles bestowed. The so-called Acts of the Apostles is a political fabrication designed to chain a free movement to an empire's history. The letters attributed to Paul finish the work. They drag the river back into the city, replace immersion with faith in words, and build a new temple in the mind. The scholars who study text criticism already admit the forgeries. Bart Ehrman and others call the letters pseudonymous. They are not the voice of a man named Paul, but the construction of a second-century church trying to stitch together its authority. If we peel away the later edits, the pattern is simple. A Nasorean teacher baptizes. His students carry that practice. They speak of light and life, not of covenant and sacrifice. They reject the temple and its god of war. They preach freedom through purification, not obedience through ritual. Then comes the scribal takeover. The editors rename the current. They call the Nasorean Nazarene. Invent a town called Nazareth to make it literal, and bury the meaning under geography. They insert Yahweh where the great life once stood. They reframe the water as symbol rather than act. And finally, they crucify the river itself by replacing immersion with blood. Every detail in the surviving text points back to that theft. The baptism scene in every gospel is the one moment that cannot be erased. It is too well known to omit, yet too dangerous to explain. The writers try to subordinate John, claiming he only prepared the way for a greater one, but they cannot hide that Jesus submits to him. That act reveals lineage. The teacher of the river anoints his successor, not a Jewish Messiah, but another Nasorean initiate. From that moment on, the editors worked to undo what the water meant. They turned spiritual cleansing into legal atonement, substitutes in language for illumination, and drag a movement of freedom back into the prison of theology. The hatred of the temple shared by John and Jesus is consistent and historical. Both denounce the sale of animals, the exchange of coins, the priestly corruption. Both call the structure a house of robbers. No person loyal to the Torah or to the God of the Torah would speak so. Their target is not simply greed, but the entire economy of sacrifice. To them, the temple is the symbol of everything wrong with religion, a monument to the false creator who enslaves through law. Their allegiance is to the source beyond creation, the great life, the light that moves through the river and renews the soul without mediator. Archaeology strengthens this reading. The baptismal practices of the Nasoreans of Mesopotamia mirror the earliest descriptions of John's rite. Continuous immersion in running water, recitation of light hymns, rejection of animal sacrifice, and avoidance of temple spaces all belong to that older current. These customs long predate the Torah system and continue today among the small Mandean community in Iraq and Iran. Their language preserves the older Aramaic forms of names like Ayahia Iohana, which means John the Teacher of Life. This is not coincidence. It is continuity. The later Christian redactors needed to suppress that heritage because it undermined their own legitimacy. A Jesus who was a Nasorean teacher of light could not serve Rome or synagogue. He could not be tamed by doctrine. So they rewrote him. They grafted him onto Jewish prophecy, gave him a legal genealogy, wrapped him in Torah, and made him die for sins that his own teaching never mentioned. Then they merged that story with imperial structure and called it faith. What had been a river of liberation became a religion of obedience. It is not blasphemy to tell this truth. It is history. The textual layers reveal the edits. The contradictions reveal the forgery. The missing archaeological footprint of a first-century Nazareth reveals the invention. The differences between the baptismal communities of the East and the temple cult of Judea reveal two opposing worldviews, one rooted in water and renewal, the other in sacrifice and submission. The editors of the New Testament merged them to create continuity where none existed. John the Baptist and Jesus belonged to the river. Their God was not Yahweh, but the great life that precedes every name. They sought direct communion, not priestly mediation. They believed that every soul was a fragment of light fallen into matter, and that immersion in living water restored memory of its origin. That is why the Nasorean texts call the waters the mother of life. That is why baptism was repeated constantly rather than performed once. It was a living sacrament, not a ritual checkbox. The later church reduced it to initiation, because a living sacrament cannot be controlled. When we remove the redactions, the message is luminous. The kingdom of heaven is not a throne above, but a purity within. The great life is not a deity that commands, but a light that flows. The river is the path back to it. The temple is the cage that blocks it. John and Jesus were rebels against that cage. The system that later enslaved their names could only do so by rewriting their story. To recover them, we must return to the water and let the current erase the lies written on parchment. History will eventually catch up with truth. Scholars already admit that the texts are edited, that the letters are forged, that the archaeology contradicts the narrative. What remains is courage. To say openly that the founders of the water movement were never Jews in the temple sense, but teachers from an older, freer tradition. The evidence is there for anyone who can read without fear. The river was before the temple. The water was before the law. The light was before the name. That is where John and Jesus stood, and that is where truth still waits. Veritas lux mesherara benuhra.